He thought humiliating her would make him unforgettable, but he had no idea he was about to be remembered for the exact opposite. The lecture hall at Westbridge University buzzed with quiet anticipation, rows of polished wooden seats filled with over 200 graduate students, their laptops glowing like a sea of blue light under the soft hum of overhead panels. And at the center of it all stood Professor Daniel Harrington, a man whose reputation was as sharp as the tailored Navy suit draped perfectly over his frame. A man known not just for brilliance, but for something colder, something students whispered about in hallways and late-night study sessions. His habit of turning curiosity into humiliation, of choosing someone in the room and dismantling them piece by piece until the lesson was no longer about mathematics, but about power. And today, as his eyes swept across the audience, there was a subtle shift in his expression, the faint curl of a smile that meant someone had already been chosen, though no one yet knew who. Near the back of the hall, almost blending into the quiet rhythm of the room, sat Clara Hayes, her presence so understated it was nearly invisible, dressed in a simple gray cardigan over a plain white shirt, her hands folded neatly over a small notebook, the kind you might find in any dollar store, her posture calm, her gaze steady but lowered just enough to avoid drawing attention. And yet there was something about her stillness that felt deliberate, as if she had mastered the art of not being seen, the art of existing without inviting judgment, something that had taken years to perfect, years of walking through rooms where people decided your worth in seconds, years of learning that silence could be both shield and strategy. Harrington tapped the chalk lightly against the board, the sharp sound cutting through the room like a cue, and without turning, he spoke in a tone that carried effortless authority. Today, we're going to explore a problem that even advanced researchers have struggled with. And with that, he began writing, symbols stretching across the board in clean, confident strokes, a complex equation that twisted and expanded with each line, layers of theory embedded within it, the kind of problem that wasn't meant to be solved in a single sitting, the kind of problem that existed more as a challenge than a question. And as he stepped back, the room fell into a thoughtful silence, students leaning forward, some already typing, others exchanging glances, but no one raising a hand, because they knew better, because in this room, volunteering was often a mistake. Harrington turned slowly, scanning the room again, and then his gaze stopped, not on the eager students in the front rows, not on the confident ones who usually spoke up, but on Clara, sitting quietly near the back, and something in his eyes sharpened, as if he had found exactly what he was looking for. "You," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably direct, and for a moment, Clara didn't react, not because she hadn't heard him, but because she had, and she understood exactly what was coming. Next, the room shifting subtly as heads turned, following his line of sight until they landed on her, confusion flickering across a few faces, curiosity across others, and then the first quiet chuckle, because she didn't look like she belonged there, because she didn't fit the image of someone who could even attempt what was on that board. Harrington gestured toward the front with a slight tilt of his head. "Would you mind coming up here and giving it a try?" he asked, though the question carried no real choice, and the room held its breath, waiting, watching, as Clara slowly stood, the soft scrape of her chair against the floor echoing louder than it should have, her steps measured, unhurried, each one deliberate as she walked down the aisle, past rows of students who now watched openly, some with smirks, others with raised brows, the weight of their attention pressing in from all sides, and yet her expression didn't change, her eyes calm, her breathing steady, as if this moment, this exact moment, was not unfamiliar to her at all. When she reached the front, Harrington handed her the chalk with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Take your time," he said, though there was a subtle edge in his voice, a quiet invitation for failure. And as Clara turned toward the board, the equation stretching before her, something shifted, almost imperceptibly, the slight tremor in her fingers stilling as they closed around the chalk, her shoulders relaxing, her gaze sharpening. And for the first time since she had entered the room, she didn't look invisible at all, and somewhere in the silence, just before the first line touched the board, there was a feeling, quiet but undeniable, that something in this room was about to change. Clara stood in front of the board, the chalk resting lightly between her fingers, and for a brief moment she did nothing, her eyes scanning the equation from left to right, top to bottom, not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone recognizing something familiar, something almost routine, and behind her, the room shifted with quiet impatience. A few students leaning back in their chairs, arms crossed, already convinced of how this would end, while others leaned forward slightly, curious to see just how quickly she would falter. And at the center of it all, Professor Harrington watched with a composed expression, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed in the confidence of a man who believed he had already controlled the outcome. A faint chuckle broke from somewhere in the middle rows, followed by another, softer this time, as if people were testing how far they could go before being noticed, and Harrington did not stop them, because he did not need to, because the silence that followed was not respectful, it was expectant, the kind of silence that waited for failure like it was part of the lesson. Clara inhaled slowly, almost unnoticeably, and then, with a calm that did not match the tension in the room, she lifted the chalk to the board and drew a single line, clean and precise, not rushed, not hesitant, just exact, and the sound of chalk against the surface, that soft, steady scrape, seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the low murmurs and pulling attention back to the front. She wrote a second line, then a third, her movements measured, each step flowing into the next as if she had already seen the entire path before she began, and somewhere in the front row, a student shifted in his seat, his brow tightening slightly as he tried to follow along, his laptop forgotten for the moment, and beside him, another student stopped typing altogether, her eyes narrowing as the structure of the solution began to take shape in a way that did not match the confusion they had expected. Harrington's expression did not change at first, but there was a subtle shift in his gaze, a slight narrowing of his eyes as he watched her progression, not yet concerned, but no longer entirely dismissive, and he took a small step closer, as if proximity might reveal a mistake more quickly. Clara continued, her hand steady, her pace unbroken, moving through transformations and substitutions with a quiet efficiency that carried no need for display, no pause for approval, and as the lines of chalk expanded across the board, the room began to change, the earlier amusement dissolving into something quieter, something sharper, the kind of attention that comes when expectation starts to crack. A whisper rose from the left side of the hall, barely audible, but enough to ripple outward. Wait, that is not wrong. And the words seemed to settle over the room like a shift in gravity, pulling more eyes forward, more focus onto the board, and suddenly the equation was no longer a spectacle, it was a puzzle unfolding in real time. Clara paused for the first time, her chalk hovering just above the surface, and for a split second, the room held its breath again. But this time it was not waiting for failure, it was waiting for confirmation, and when she resumed, the next steps came even faster, her movements more assured, as if the final pieces had already aligned in her mind. Harrington stepped closer now, his presence no longer distant, his gaze fixed on the board, tracking each line, each transition, and there was a flicker, small but unmistakable, of something unfamiliar in his expression, not doubt, not yet, but the absence of certainty. Clara finished a sequence, then moved to the side slightly, creating space, and began a new line that diverged from the expected path, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. But to those who were following closely, it was different. It was not the standard approach, and a low murmur began to build, quickly hushed, as if the room itself was unsure how to react. A student in the second row leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. That is not how he taught it. And someone beside him responded just as quietly, but it works. And the realization spread not through noise, but through stillness, the kind of stillness that grows when understanding arrives all at once. Clara's final steps came without hesitation, each line placed with deliberate clarity, and when she reached the end, she did not step back dramatically. She simply lowered the chalk, her hand relaxing at her side, and for a moment, nothing happened. The room suspended in a silence that felt heavier than before, not empty, but full, as if every person present was recalculating something they thought they understood. Harrington stood just a few feet away now, his eyes fixed on the board, tracing the solution from beginning to end, and the longer he looked, the longer he said nothing, and in that silence, something shifted that could not be undone. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, thick and unmoving, until even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than before, and in that suspended moment, every pair of eyes remained locked on the board. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, they shifted to Professor Harrington, waiting, watching, because the man who always had an answer now stood completely still, his gaze fixed on the final line Clara had written, tracing it again and again as if repetition might reveal a flaw. That was not there. He stepped closer, close enough that the edge of his sleeve nearly brushed the chalk dust, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in dismissal this time, but in calculation, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Walk me through this step," he said, pointing to the transition that had drawn the most attention, the unconventional pivot that had shifted the entire structure of the solution. Clara turned her head slightly, her expression calm, almost neutral, as if the question itself carried no weight, and she answered without hesitation, her voice steady, clear, explaining the logic with a precision that did not seek approval, only accuracy. And as she spoke, something else began to happen in the room, something subtle but undeniable. The students who had once leaned back now leaned forward. The ones who had smirked now watched in silence, and a few began to nod, slowly at first, then with growing certainty, because what she was saying was not just correct, it was elegant. Harrington listened, his posture tightening almost imperceptibly, his hand lowering from the board as her explanation unfolded, each word reinforcing what his eyes had already begun to accept, and for a brief moment, he opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but then closed it. Again, because there was nothing to interrupt, no obvious error, no misstep to seize, and that absence was louder than any correction he could have made. A student in the front row raised a hand instinctively, then lowered it again, unsure if speaking would break whatever was happening, and somewhere behind him, another voice whispered, "She is not guessing," and the words carried further than intended, settling into the space between rows, adding to the quiet realization spreading through the room. Clara turned back to the board, not to continue, but to adjust a small detail, a refinement rather than a correction, and that single motion drew a sharper reaction than anything before, because it suggested control, not chance, and Harrington saw it too, his gaze following the movement, his expression shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to those who knew him well. The first crack in a reputation built on certainty. He stepped back slightly, creating space between himself and the board, as if distance might restore perspective, and for the first time since the lecture began, he looked at Clara not as a participant, but as something else, something he had not anticipated, and the room felt it, that shift in perception, that subtle reordering of roles that no one had planned for. "Where did you learn this approach?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Clara paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the moment, the way attention now focused not on the equation, but on her, and when she spoke, her voice remained even. "I have seen problems like this before," she said, and nothing more, no elaboration, no attempt to justify or impress, just a statement that left more questions than it answered. A quiet ripple moved through the audience, curiosity replacing certainty, and Harrington's eyes held on her for a second longer than necessary, as if searching for something behind the simplicity of her words, something that would restore the balance he had lost. But whatever he was looking for, he did not find it. He turned back to the board, his gaze moving across the solution once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and then, almost reluctantly, he nodded, a small, controlled motion that carried more weight than any speech, and the room reacted. Not with applause, not with noise, but with a deeper silence, the kind that follows understanding, the kind that settles when something undeniable has just taken place. And in that silence, as Clara stood quietly beside the board, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, there was a single thought that passed through more than one mind at the same time, unspoken but clear, that the person they had just witnessed was not who they thought she was at all. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the walls of the lecture hall like something permanent, and Professor Harrington stood there for a moment longer than anyone had ever seen before, his usual composure now replaced with a careful stillness, as if every word he might say next carried risk, and that alone was enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the room. Because this was a man who never hesitated, never second-guessed, and yet now, with over 200 eyes watching him, he chose his next move with visible precision. He cleared his throat softly, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and turned slightly toward the class, though his attention remained divided, still anchored to the board, still pulled toward the solution that refused to unravel under scrutiny. "Interesting approach," he said finally, his tone controlled, measured, but lacking the sharp edge that had defined him earlier, and a few students exchanged glances, because they recognized what that meant. Not praise, but acknowledgement, something he did not give lightly, and certainly not to someone like Clara Hayes. But he was not finished, because men like Harrington did not surrender control easily. They redirected it, reshaped it, and he turned back toward Clara with a faint, calculated smile, one that suggested the moment was not over, only evolving. However, he continued, letting the word hang just long enough to pull the room back into tension. A correct answer does not necessarily mean a complete understanding. And there it was, the attempt to reclaim ground, to reposition the narrative, to remind everyone that he still defined the standard. A few students shifted again, the earlier silence now edged with anticipation, because they understood what was happening. This was no longer just a solution, it was a test of authority. Harrington picked up a piece of chalk himself and moved to the far side of the board, writing quickly, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as a new equation began to take form, more complex, more abstract, layered with notation that even advanced students struggled to follow. And when he stepped back, he gestured toward it with a subtle tilt of his head. "Let us try something less familiar," he said, his voice steady. But there was something beneath it now, something tighter, something that had not been there before, and the room felt it immediately. Clara did not move right away. She simply turned her gaze from the completed solution to the new problem, her expression unchanged, her posture the same calm stillness she had carried from the beginning, and for a brief second, it seemed as though time slowed again, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if this would be the moment where balance returned, where the professor reasserted himself, where the narrative corrected itself. But Clara stepped forward without hesitation, the small sound of her shoes against the floor grounding the moment in something real, something steady, and she reached for the chalk again, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with the same quiet control that had already changed everything. Harrington watched closely now, closer than before, his attention no longer casual, no longer distant, and as Clara began to write, the difference was immediate, not in speed, but in certainty, her hand moving with a confidence that did not pause to consider doubt, her lines forming patterns that did not look like guesses, but like recognition. The students felt it again, that subtle shift, the return of that deeper silence, not the silence of expectation, but the silence of focus, the kind that falls when something important is unfolding, and no one wanted to miss it. A student near the aisle leaned forward, whispering under his breath, "That is not standard," and another responded, even quieter, "No, it is better," and the words did not spread loudly, but they spread enough. Harrington's jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, as he followed her work, his eyes moving faster now, tracking, verifying, searching for something to challenge, something to question, but each step held, each transition connected, and the structure that emerged was not just valid, it was refined, and that refinement carried a weight he could not ignore. Clara reached the midpoint of the problem and paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision, adjusting a single line, a subtle correction that simplified what had been unnecessarily complex. And that was when it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough for those paying attention. Harrington exhaled, a small, controlled breath, the kind a person takes when they realize they are no longer ahead. The room felt it instantly, and for the first time since the lecture began, it was not Clara who stood in question, it was him. The air in the lecture hall felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of what was unfolding had settled into every corner of the room, and Clara Hayes stood at the board with the same quiet composure, her hand moving steadily as she completed the final sequence of the second problem, each line flowing into the next with a clarity that left no room for doubt. and when she reached the end, she did not pause for effect. She simply placed the chalk down gently on the ledge and stepped back half a pace, her eyes still on the board, as if confirming what she had already known before she ever began. No one spoke, not a single whisper. The room, once filled with judgment and quiet laughter, now held only stillness, the kind that follows something undeniable, something that cannot be dismissed or explained away. Professor Harrington remained where he stood, just a few feet from the board, his gaze fixed on the solution, and for a long moment, he did not move at all, his posture rigid, his usual confidence replaced by something far more fragile, something he had spent years ensuring no one would ever see. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped forward, his eyes scanning each line again, but this time not searching for error, not expecting failure, but verifying what he already knew to be true, and the longer he looked, the clearer it became that there was nothing to challenge, nothing to correct, nothing to reclaim. A student in the front row shifted, his voice barely above a breath. "That is cleaner than the original method," and another nodded silently, their attention still locked on the board, as if afraid that looking away might somehow undo what they had just witnessed. Harrington exhaled quietly, a controlled breath that did little to steady the shift that had already taken place, and when he finally turned, his eyes met Clara's for the first time without superiority, without distance, just recognition, and that alone was enough to send a subtle ripple through the room. "This method," he began, his voice slower now, more measured than anyone had ever heard it. "It is not published." And it was not a question, it was a realization, one that carried weight far beyond the equation itself. Clara held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression calm, almost unreadable, and then she spoke, her voice steady. "Not yet." And the words settled into the silence with quiet precision, leaving no space for misunderstanding. A murmur moved through the room, soft but undeniable, curiosity sharpening into something closer to awe, because this was no longer just about solving a problem. This was something else entirely, something that reached beyond the classroom, beyond the lecture, into a space few of them had ever touched. Harrington's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in thought, and he turned back to the board once more, his eyes tracing the structure, the elegance, the simplicity that made it so powerful, and for the first time in years, perhaps longer, he found himself not leading, but following, not instructing, but learning. A faculty member seated near the side aisle, someone who had quietly observed the entire exchange, leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough to carry that approach. "I saw something similar at a conference in Boston nearly a decade ago," and he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as memory aligned with what he now saw in front of him. But it was never completed, and the implication hung in the air, unfinished but understood. Harrington turned sharply at that, his attention snapping to the comment, then back to Clara, his expression shifting again, not to regain control, but to understand, truly understand, and for a brief moment, the authority he had built seemed almost irrelevant in the face of what stood before him. "Your name," he said quietly, not because he did not know it, but because he needed to hear it again, needed to place it in a context that made sense. Clara did not hesitate. "Clara Hayes," she replied, the same name they had all heard at the beginning, but it carried a different weight now, a different meaning, and Harrington repeated it under his breath, as if testing it against something in his memory, something just out of reach. And then it came, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, unmistakable alignment, a connection forming between the quiet woman in front of him and something buried in his past, something he had not thought about in years, and his expression changed once more, not with confidence, not with control, but with the dawning understanding that the person he had tried to diminish was someone he should have recognized all along. The room remained silent, watching, waiting, and in that silence, the balance had fully shifted, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful, something undeniable, the quiet, absolute presence of truth. The name lingered in the air longer than it should have. Clara Hayes, simple, unremarkable on its own, and yet something in Professor Harrington's expression made it clear that it was not the first time he had heard it, not in this room, not in this context, but somewhere deeper, somewhere buried beneath years of accolades, publications, and carefully curated authority, and as he stood there, staring at her with a focus that no longer carried superiority, the pieces began to shift into place. Slowly, uncomfortably, like a memory he had tried not to revisit. The lecture hall remained completely still, no one daring to interrupt the moment. Because something was happening that had nothing to do with grades or lectures anymore. Something that felt personal, something that felt like truth surfacing whether anyone was ready for it or not. Harrington's eyes moved from Clara to the board and back again. And then, almost to himself, he said quietly, "Hayes, that paper." And he stopped, as if even saying it out loud required effort, and a few students exchanged confused glances, because to them, this was new, but to him, it was not entirely. Clara did not react immediately. She simply stood there, her posture calm, her expression unchanged, as if she had been expecting this moment, not hoping for it, not seeking it, but prepared for it, and that quiet readiness only made the tension sharper. A faculty member near the side leaned forward again, his voice low but more certain this time. "Clara Hayes, the unpublished thesis from MIT. 10 years ago." And the words landed like a key turning in a lock, the final piece aligning with everything the room had just witnessed. A ripple moved through the students, not loud, but undeniable, curiosity shifting into realization, because even those who had never read the paper had heard of it, a theory that had been discussed, debated, and then suddenly disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only fragments and speculation. Harrington closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in recognition, and when he opened them again, there was no trace of the man who had stood at the front of the room earlier, no trace of the controlled arrogance that had defined him, only the quiet awareness that he had been standing in front of something he did not fully understand. "You left," he said finally, his voice steady but softer than before, and it was not an accusation, not a challenge, just a statement that carried years of unanswered questions. Clara met his gaze, her eyes clear, unwavering, and for the first time since she had stepped into the room, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not pride, not satisfaction, but something closer to closure. "No," she replied gently. "I was removed," and the simplicity of her words carried a weight that filled the entire space, heavier than any equation, heavier than any proof written on the board. The room absorbed it slowly, the implications settling in layers, and Harrington's expression changed again, not with confusion this time, but with understanding, the kind that arrives too late to be useful, but too clear to ignore. He looked back at the board, at the solution she had written, at the method that had once been incomplete, dismissed, and then forgotten, and now stood fully realized in front of him, not as theory, not as potential, but as fact. A student in the front row whispered, barely audible, "She finished it," and the words carried through the silence, not as a question, but as a realization shared by everyone present. Harrington exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but steady, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to prove, and in that absence, something rare took its place, something that did not come easily to him, something he had spent years avoiding, humility. He turned fully toward Clara now, no longer positioning himself between her and the class, no longer controlling the space, and when he spoke again, his voice was clear, but different, stripped of performance, stripped of authority. "I remember your work," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften or redirect, just acknowledgement, and the room felt it, that shift, that quiet but undeniable reversal. Clara nodded slightly, not as confirmation, but as acceptance, as if this moment, this recognition, was not something she needed, but something he did. The students watched, silent, absorbing everything, because they understood now that what they had witnessed was not just brilliance, not just a demonstration, but a correction, a moment where something long overlooked had finally been seen clearly. And as the silence settled once more, deeper than before, it carried with it a single, unspoken truth that no one in that room would forget, that the person they had almost dismissed had just redefined everything they thought they understood. The silence did not feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt earned, like the room itself understood it was witnessing something that did not happen often, something that could not be repeated on command, and Clara Hayes stood there with the same quiet composure, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the entire space, while Professor Harrington remained facing her, not as an authority figure, not as the center of the room, but as someone who had just been forced to reconsider everything he believed about control, about recognition, about who deserved to be seen. He took a slow step back, creating space between them, not to distance himself, but to give the moment room to exist without interference. And when he turned toward the class, his posture was different, not weaker, but more deliberate, as if every movement now carried awareness instead of assumption. "Class," he said, his voice steady, but stripped of the sharp edge it once held. "What you have just seen is not an error correction. It is a completed framework." And the words settled across the rows like a shift in understanding, because this was no longer about a lecture, no longer about instruction. It was acknowledgement, and coming from him, it carried weight that no textbook ever could. A few students straightened in their seats, their attention no longer divided, no longer casual, but focused with a kind of respect that had not been there before, not for him, but for her, and that change was impossible to ignore. Clara did not react to the statement. She simply remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes calm, as if recognition was not something she had been waiting for, but something that had finally caught up to her. Harrington turned back to the board once more, his gaze moving across the equations with a slower, more thoughtful pace. And then he did something no one in that room had ever seen him do. He picked up the chalk and added a small notation beneath her work, not to correct it, not to alter it, but to reference it, to frame it. And when he stepped aside, it was clear that the board no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the work itself. A student in the middle row raised his hand, hesitant at first, then more certain. "Professor, does this mean the original model was incomplete?" And the question hung in the air, bold but careful. And for a moment, Harrington did not answer immediately, because this was the kind of question that once would have been dismissed, redirected, controlled. But now, he considered it fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried a clarity that did not rely on authority. "Yes," he said simply, and the room absorbed it all at once, the admission, the shift, the truth that had just been spoken without defense or qualification. A quiet murmur followed, not of confusion, but of realization, because they understood what that meant, not just for the equation, but for everything that had led up to this moment. Clara turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room for the first time, meeting the eyes of students who had once dismissed her without thought. And there was no judgment in her expression, no need to reclaim anything, just a quiet presence that spoke louder than any response could have. Harrington watched her for a moment longer, and then, almost as if recognizing something beyond the room itself, he spoke again. "Your work should not have been overlooked." And this time, the statement was not directed at the class, it was directed at her, and it carried something rare, something that did not come easily, not apology exactly, but something close enough that the difference did not matter. Clara held his gaze briefly, then nodded once, a small, measured motion that acknowledged the words without holding on to them. And in that exchange, something settled, something that did not need to be spoken aloud. The lecture hall remained still, but it was no longer the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of understanding, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. And as the class sat there, watching the board, watching her, watching him, there was a single realization that moved quietly through every row, that what had just unfolded was not just a lesson in mathematics, but a reminder of something far more important, something that could not be written in equations or proven on a board, that brilliance does not announce itself, and respect, when it finally arrives, often comes far too late. But when it does, it changes everything. No one moved to leave when the clock quietly passed the end of the scheduled lecture. No backpack zipped, no chair scraped back, because something in the room refused to return to normal, as if the space itself understood that what had just happened was not finished yet. And Clara Hayes remained at the front, not claiming the moment, not extending it, simply existing within it, her presence steady, grounded, while Professor Harrington stood a few steps away, no longer directing the room, no longer controlling its rhythm, but observing, as if he too was waiting for something else to unfold. A student near the aisle finally broke the stillness, not with noise, but with a quiet question that carried further than expected. Why did no one know? And it was not directed at Clara, not directly at Harrington either, but at the situation itself, at the gap between what was and what had been assumed, and the room seemed to lean into that question, because it echoed something many were already thinking. Clara's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the student, but toward the rows beyond, as if considering how to answer something that could not be explained in a single sentence. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, measured, carrying no bitterness, only clarity. Because it was easier not to look, and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not accusing, not dramatic, but undeniable. A few students lowered their eyes, not out of guilt, but recognition, the kind that comes when something simple exposes something deeper. Harrington did not interrupt, did not redirect. He simply listened, his posture still, his attention fully present, and that alone marked how much had changed. Clara turned slightly toward the board, her eyes resting briefly on the equations, then back to the room, and there was a softness in her expression now, not weakness, but distance, as if she had already moved past this moment long before it arrived. 10 years ago, she continued, her voice steady, I presented the beginning of that model, and she gestured lightly toward the work on the board, and it was dismissed, and the statement was simple, almost quiet, but it carried a history that filled the room without needing to be detailed. A faculty member near the side shifted in his seat, his expression tightening slightly, as if recalling something he had once overlooked, and Harrington's gaze dropped briefly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement of something he could no longer ignore. Not because it was wrong, Clara added, her tone unchanged, but because I did not fit what people expected to see. And this time, the words lingered longer, not as an explanation, but as a reflection that extended beyond the room, beyond the university, into something larger. The students remained silent, but the silence was no longer passive. It was engaged, each person processing what had been said, what had been revealed, and what it meant for everything they thought they understood about merit, about recognition, about who gets to be heard. Harrington finally moved, a small step forward, not to reclaim space, but to stand beside the board again, his eyes on the equations, then on Clara, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before, that should not have happened, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to soften or redirect, just a statement of fact, and in that moment, it was enough. Clara met his gaze briefly, then looked back toward the room, her expression calm, unchanged, as if his words, while acknowledged, did not alter what had already been lived, what had already been carried forward. A student in the back row raised her hand slowly, her voice careful. Are you going to publish it now? And the question brought a subtle shift, a new kind of anticipation, not about what had happened, but about what might come next. Clara paused for a moment, considering, not the question itself, but the weight behind it, and then she gave a small, almost thoughtful nod. It is already written, she said simply, and the words landed with quiet certainty, not as a promise, but as a statement of completion. The room absorbed it, the realization that what they had just seen was not a spontaneous moment, not an isolated event, but the final step of something that had been built long before they ever witnessed it. Harrington stepped back again, his gaze lingering on the board, then on the students, and finally on Clara, and there was no longer any question of who held the center of the room, no longer any illusion of hierarchy, only the quiet understanding that had replaced it. And as the silence settled once more, deeper and more complete than before, it carried with it a truth that did not need to be spoken again, that recognition does not create value, it only reveals what was always there. The room remained still long after the moment should have ended, as if no one wanted to be the first to move, the first to break the quiet understanding that had settled over every seat, every desk, every breath in that lecture hall, and Clara Hayes stood there for just a moment longer, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, simply allowing the silence to complete what words no longer needed to explain. Then, with a calm that had defined her from the beginning, she reached for her notebook, the same small, unremarkable one she had carried in without notice, and closed it gently, the soft sound barely audible, yet somehow enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural end. She turned toward the aisle without urgency, without hesitation, and began to walk, her steps steady, measured, the same way she had walked down earlier, except now every eye followed her, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with something quieter, something earned. No one laughed. No one whispered. The room simply watched. Professor Harrington remained at the front, his gaze fixed on the board for a second longer before shifting to her as she passed. And for the first time, he did not speak, did not attempt to frame the moment, did not reclaim it as part of his lecture, because he understood that it no longer belonged to him. A student near the front stood instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to respect, and then another, and another, until the movement spread without instruction, without coordination, a quiet, collective acknowledgement that required no announcement. Clara did not stop, did not turn. She simply continued walking, her expression unchanged, her presence as grounded as it had been from the beginning, as if what had just happened was not a performance, not a victory, but simply the truth finally allowed to exist where it always should have. She reached the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle, and for a fraction of a second, she paused, not to look back, not to seek confirmation, but as if marking the boundary between what had been and what would come next, and then she stepped out, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room in a silence that felt fuller than before. No one moved immediately. The board remained untouched, the equations still fresh, the chalk lines holding their clarity, and Professor Harrington stood beside them, no longer the sole voice of the room, no longer the unquestioned authority, but something else entirely, something more human, more aware, and as he looked at the work in front of him, there was no longer any need to explain it, no longer any need to interpret it for others, because its meaning was already understood. A student finally spoke, quietly, almost to himself. We almost missed that, and the words carried just far enough for others to hear, not as a statement of regret, but as a realization that would stay with them far beyond this room. Harrington did not respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was calm, steady, stripped of anything unnecessary. No, he said softly, his eyes still on the board. We did miss it, and there was no defense in his tone, no attempt to lessen the weight of the truth, only acceptance, and that acceptance settled into the room just as deeply as everything else that had unfolded. The students remained seated, their attention no longer on him, but on what they had witnessed, on what it meant, on what it revealed about the way they saw the world, and for the first time, the lecture hall did not feel like a place of instruction, but a place of realization. Outside, the hallway carried on as it always did, footsteps, voices, the ordinary rhythm of a university day, and Clara Hayes walked through it quietly, unnoticed once again by those who had not been in that room, her figure blending into the flow of people, her presence returning to the same simplicity it had always held, and yet nothing about her had changed, only the way she had been seen. And inside that lecture hall, the board remained, the equations unaltered, a silent reminder of a moment when everything shifted, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity, through truth, through the quiet certainty of someone who never needed to prove anything, only to be given the chance to be seen. And on that day, in that room, the world, for a brief moment, remembered what that looked like.